Here we go. Hello, and I believe we are live on Facebook. So my name's Christina Lennon. Most of you probably watching know who I am. Laura, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Laura Serrant, and I am an inclusion and diversity specialist, and I particularly have interest in people being able to speak their stories and speak for themselves, and how we can use the stories that we hear and the experiences that we live with to help ourselves and help other people to kind of challenge to meet some of the challenges that we meet, and actually to make sense of what's happening to us.
Yeah. So you've put Laura Serrant. Can we have the full title, please?
All right, okay. My full Sunday name, as my mother would say, is Professor Laura Serrant, OBE.
Yes. And what did you get the OBE for?
I got the OBE in 2018, and I got it for services to nursing and health policy. I'm a qualified nurse. I was qualified in 1986. And I've been on the professional register since then. But I've done a lot of work, both nationally and internationally, with governments and agencies around health equity. And that's really been around making sure that we have policies and strategies and local activities and initiatives which give people an equal chance of good health. And really, I suppose my take on health is reflection of the World Health Organization, and that is looking at health as a social, as an emotional, as a physical, and as a mental well-being, which brings us, I suppose, to some of the things that we're going to talk about today, because what we're seeing today in all spheres, I think, in 2020 is what happens when we have an unequal opportunity of health in that broad sense.
Yeah, because unfortunately at the minute we seem to have a racist virus on our hands as well as everything else.
We do indeed. I think it's interesting. I wrote an article on LinkedIn not long ago. I think it was last week. It came out about how champion inclusion during the coronavirus pandemic, COVID-19. And I think what is important for us to understand, and I think this is important in thinking about coronavirus and COVID-19 where we are today, but it's also important in thinking about the issues around following the death of George Floyd and the issues that we see in America and issues around racism generally, is that all these things are not new things. The coronavirus is a new virus, but pandemics used to be called plagues, and obviously we've all heard about plagues, so it's just a different name for the same thing. So it's something that happens and that's happened over many years, many generations, and what they show us, pandemics and issues around racism, what we see now, it shows us what is sick in our society, so where the inequality lies. Because actually, if you look at COVID-19 and you look at the bubonic plague, or you look at any other pandemics of the past, the same thing happens. It disproportionately impacts on the lives of those people who are usually not counted or not as important within our society.
So, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this live stream, and I've been on social media and I've read so much nonsense that I feel like my IQ has lowered somewhat. And I think it was Nelson Mandela that said, when fools multiply, when wise men are quiet. So I was thinking, who's wise that I can speak to? And then obviously you came up on our radar. And firstly, what I think a lot of white people are wanting to support the Black Lives Matter cause.
Yes.
And they're saying all the wrong things and then being labeled as racist or ignorant. And So I wanted to address that, and I think there's learning for on both sides here, if not that there are sides, but there's learning for both sides. First of all, what is politically correct? What would I call you?
I think
Apart from Laura.
apart from Laura, of course, which is my name. Okay. The thing about labeling descriptors is there are the personal labels that we like to use. So the things people know what they would prefer to call themselves. And I think that is one of the most important things. And then there are issues that are politically correct, and they're not necessary. Sometimes they're the same and sometimes they're not, because labels are move and they change over periods of time. I describe myself as a Black woman. And I use the term Black as a political term. It both describes physiologically for me what I look like, but it also describes my political position and my understanding, or my political stance. And I use the term Black to describe the experiences of discrimination and experiences of marginalization and the experience of feeling less than or silenced, which is experienced by people whose skin color is not white. That's how I use it.
Right.
So I use the term Black. So when I use the term Black, that's kind of what I'm reflecting and where I'm positioning myself. But ultimately, and that's where I would say it's used when I see it in writings, when I do readings. That's my understanding. That's how I read it. So I would say I'm a Black woman. I think that it's important that there are generational differences in how people describe themselves, and there are societal differences in how people describe themselves. My mother, for example, it took her a while to call herself a Black woman, because when she was younger, it was polite to be, for her, in her mind, polite to be called coloured. Whereas for me, that would be a definite no. So I think sometimes we have to understand the context in which a word is being used. And I think that's the important thing I'm saying. I think in the 2020, I would say I would call myself a Black woman. And if someone said I'm talking about Black people, I know what that means based on the political definition I've given you. However, I think that it's important to listen to how people describe themselves.
Yeah.
So I think I think that is the most important. There is no shame in not knowing what's the right word. The shame comes in not asking what's the right word. So just as you said, I mean, what would you say? Nobody's going to be insulted, or I've never met any Black, Asian, minority ethnic person who's insulted by saying, what would you prefer me to use?
Yeah.
Because that is acknowledging that, everybody's not lumped together the same, but also it acknowledges that you recognize that, there is the potential to cause offense. So you would just ask. And I think that is really a lot of this. Ask the question.
Yeah. I think that is a lot of the problem. At the minute, I'm seeing the term POC used, people of colour. And it goes back to, back in the day, my mum used to say, "Oh, the coloured person." I'd be like, oh, "Mum, you can't say that, it's Black." And now it's like, my daughter said, "Oh, the colour thing's the in thing now." I think that might be more in America. So then the term I use is dual heritage. But I mean, years ago, we've had half caste, we've had mixed race. What is dual heritage the right term for somebody of mixed origin?
I think, again, I would say the same thing, Christina. I would say that for me, dual heritage is, or multiple heritage, is much more of a political term, reflecting, again, the experiences of having, or in your own, not historically, because historically we're all mixed at some point down the line, but the experience of living today as somebody whose parents or grandparents, so your immediate kind of like, are from different ethnic or racial groups. And some people call themselves dual heritage. And again, I would say that, remain alert and listen to how someone describes themselves. And if you're not sure, say, look, you know, I'm not sure, how would you prefer me to, would you like me to refer to you?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the thing is that sometimes people get very, very so afraid of saying the wrong thing that they say nothing. And I was listening this morning actually to Meghan Markle, who on YouTube, she did a little clip for the graduating students of her university. I think it was UCLA in America, and she was speaking to them. And she said something very key, which is something that I said, oh, I've said that many, many times, is that actually the worst thing to say is to say nothing. Yeah. So the worst thing is, with all this going on, and it's in the press, it's in the news, you know, not just around America and what's happened with George Floyd. You know, we've got here in the UK, we have the conversations around COVID-19, around the disproportionate number of Black and minority ethnic healthcare dying, the disproportionate number of Black and minority ethnic communities who have died or who have worse outcomes as a result of COVID-19. Mm-hmm. And not to make, and you know, if you are working with groups of Black people, Black communities, friends, neighbours, members of your family, whatever it happens to be, if you actually remain silent, that is, let's just carry on with all this turmoil, all these things, then that's more damaging than saying the wrong thing at all.
Yeah,
it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to conversation. It's an opportunity, maybe, to, you know, to acknowledge what do you, can you do my job or that person's job to explain it to you. But it is our responsibility to engage in a conversation with you about it. I think opening conversation.
The signal went a bit funny there. I don't know if anybody can let me know whether they can hear clearly or not. So I think you're breaking up a little bit, Laura.
Am I?
You are a bit, yes. Yeah, I think I've from speaking to white people that want to support, many people at the moment don't know how to support, or even if they should support, and it's for fear of saying the wrong thing. And I think at the minute tensions are high, and people I've shared, you know, the Blackout Tuesday, for instance, you shared it, and you were supposed to put the hashtag Blackout Tuesday, and then people were going crazy saying you can't use the hashtag Black Lives Matter because people are scrolling past. And so then you're like, oh, right, done the wrong thing there. And then people are sharing, somebody shared All Lives Matter. And this has been hit with a massive backlash. And I think some people are sort of saying all lives matter to show their support. And then other people are saying, no, you can't say that, it's Black Lives Matter. So explain to the people, if you can, why we shouldn't be saying all lives matter, why we should be saying Black Lives Matter.
Okay. I think there's a lots of things kind of, I suppose, linked together in all this. There's lots of things that are in what you've asked. There's lots of things all linked together. What we have to, I suppose, sometimes is, I suppose the key word I want to say first is we need to educate ourselves in what is happening. So Black Lives Matter movement is a political movement, an activist movement that started in response to the death of Trayvon Martin. If you remember, right back in 2012, he was killed. He was unarmed and killed by a George Zimmerman, who was then acquitted of his shooting, a young man. And the Black Lives Matter movement in America arose out of that. A year later, they started using the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And the focus of the movement is a movement against the institutional racism and the police discrimination and brutality and death of African Americans at the hands of that justice system. So that's where the Black Lives Matter came from. At some time later, the All Lives Matter hashtag was brought out, and most people's thoughts are that was brought out as an I suppose in challenge to the Black Lives Matter hashtag. So the hashtag was brought out in challenge to the other hashtag. So hence why if you know that history, you can understand why if people use it today, let's say we're 8-10 years later, but in good faith, you can see why it would cause that backlash. Yeah, because it would be perceived, or it could be perceived as, well, actually, it's not about the All Lives Matter. It's about, because now Black Lives Matter is being, is so much across the social media. Here we are again with a challenge to kind of dampening down of the impact of race and racism on people's lives. So that is the history. So if you don't educate yourself to the history, it's easy it is a mistake I would say in the majority of cases, it's not to say that all lives don't matter. I mean, certainly for me personally and professionally, that's my stance. The whole point of doing work around inclusion and diversity and inclusive practice is the fact that we all should have an equal chance. So absolutely all lives do matter, but the hashtag has a different connotation. And I think, again, that makes it quite complicated, because it's not, people say, well, are they saying that all lives don't matter? No, it's not that. And I think that is where sometimes here, as elsewhere, we can get caught up in the wrong arguments, or in arguments that we think, well, why is this an issue? But it's because of a lack of education. It's not part of our system of education. It's not something that we learn as youngsters growing up. But equally, our responsibility for ourselves and for our next generation is to educate ourselves to where things come from, and not just, because otherwise all it ends up being is Blackout Tuesday was, a couple of days ago, and then we just go back to doing the same thing. Yeah. So the responsibility for us is to educate ourselves. And going back to the point you made about fear of saying the wrong thing, I think that's where we lost some of our contact, baby. The worst thing is to say nothing. This is the best time to ask those questions. Not necessarily someone to give you the answer, but actually just to understand someone's opinion or view on something. And like everything else, it gives you a starting point to start a conversation. So, your friends, the friends, the family, the neighbors, the community that surround you, that are different to yourself, and that is whether you're Black and they are white, whether you're white and they're Black, and equal. And I just want to say a point, just a moment, around the Black Lives Matter issue, but also about what I describe as the political definition of Black. There's also the word minority ethnic, which people use. People say, what's the difference between Black and minority ethnic? And for me, it's about recognizing that not everybody with white skin color is a member of the British, or if you're in England, the kind of the majority population. There are also people whose skin colors are not Black who experience discrimination as well. But the discrimination is not based on their skin color, and it's different, because there's an opportunity to choose to be outed or not as not being of UK origin if you're in the UK. But I think we mustn't automatically assume that everybody white has the same privilege. Yes. And that again is about bringing a conversation. But the Black Lives Matter is about the fact that, you and I both have minority kind of family experiences in a different way. But I can't choose when I walk down the street whether somebody knows that. And I think if you think about that in the everyday, that's really where the difference lies.
Yeah. And this is I had a conversation with my son about this, and he said he thinks he's been brought up with white privilege because for all he's mixed, he looks to, I think to white people, they just assume he's white, but to people of color, they recognize that he's of dual heritage. But then he also told me about his friend who, to anybody, would say she is a person of color, and she said that she hadn't experienced racism and she thought she had been brought up with white privilege. How can that be if you are clearly of color? Is it an attitude? I've chosen not to educate my son as much about slavery because I don't want him to believe he's come from a lesser past than anybody else. So I haven't, yes, he's aware, but I haven't focused on that. What would you
I think the thing
is it my duty to teach him about that?
I think it's all our duties to teach our children about the value and the importance, impact, the difference. So I think that, just because, you happen to be born into a Black family doesn't mean that you know everything that there is to know. You know everything about your own experience and your family experience. But the whole point here is that, not all Black people have the same experience exactly the same. Not all white people have the same experience exactly the same. And the diversity and difference is as important to understand within a particular race or ethnicity. So one of the things, for example, going back to what you're saying, is how can somebody have white privilege if they are Black? Okay. I think it's not so much about white privilege, but there is a thing of privilege. George Orwell in the book Animal Farm says all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And that's really key, because really what it's about is, for me anyway, it's about something called intersectionality, which you may not have heard of. And this was something that was coined by, and again, I feel like I'm giving you all a reading list, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a Black woman in America, who really started to talk about intersectionality when she talked about the experiences of Black women as part of the feminist movement. You'd think, well, if it's feminism, it's all about gender, so it doesn't matter whether you're Black, white, etc., we're all women. But what she said was that race and ethnicity is one facet, but it sometimes modifies or is modified by, it's changed by other things. So let me give you an example. As a Black woman myself, I was born into a working class family, a large family. We lived in what would now be called part of the slum clearance, of the time. So back-to-back terraced houses. We were poor relative to everybody else, although everybody around us was equally poor. So we didn't feel poor in the area where we lived. And somewhere else, you could see the difference. So the thing that modified there, everybody where I lived had very little financial, very money. We were poor, but we were all educated. Yes, but some of us were Black and some were white. So as a Black person, I've been to university, I live in a nice house, I live in a nice area, etc. But I'm still Black. But my ability to access resources, to pay for things, to have nice things to my children is based on the fact that I earn a certain amount of money, that I, education, that I live in certain places, but I'm still Black. But some of my experiences are the same as those of my friends and my neighbours who equally still live in the poorest areas, but some of them are very different. And that's where so it's not so much white privilege. So for example, if you have all those other things that add in together, they may give you a better or worse chance of good health in the way I described it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we've seen with, for example, with COVID, which is what we've seen now. And we've seen in America, yes, there are, if you look to see who are the Black Americans, who are the people most likely to be stopped, to be, to have had negative experience with the police, to have died at the hands of that. Yes, they are all Black, but they're more likely to be people who live in the poorer areas.
Yeah.
Etc. So other things lay on top. So sometimes it's a lack of the right words, So often this is where younger people and other generations comes in with. You're describing is privilege. It's not white privilege because she's not white, but they are the things possibly normally used as part of white privilege: access to resources, better education, not worrying about whether you go to eat, not having to worry about when your child goes out, are they going to get stopped by the police? Because the reality is, my sons and my daughter, they have privilege based on, the fact that they've had access to really good resources. But driving down in a car, just because until he's stopped, it's just a Black young man in a car.
Mm. But then,
do you see what I mean?
Yeah, but then I imagine then as soon as he opens his mouth, it's really interesting because I think people consciously think they are not prejudiced. And I read a book called Blink, and in there is a Harvard study, and it's all about prejudice. And at a subconscious level, everybody that does this test finds out that they are actually prejudiced at a subconscious level.
Mm-hmm.
So we all have these prejudice under, bubbling underneath. Yes. And I think, as a policeman, they stop a Black person that might fit a description or might look suspect. But then as soon as they speak to them, they make another judgment based on how they speak, their attitude, their clothes, how their car looks. We're making thousands of unconscious judgments. And I think that's where the privilege part comes in. It's not just, it's initially the first thing I see is, you're a Black woman. As soon as you open, I'm also looking at your surroundings, it doesn't look like you're in a slum, the way you speak, it tells me something else. The way you dress tells me something else. The way you portray yourself. So we are perception creators, I think. And so privilege is not just about color. It's about many, many different things.
It is, absolutely. And the one thing I would say, Christina, is that everybody is prejudiced. Prejudice is part of the human condition.
Yeah.
It's prejudice. It might be with a big capital P or with a small p, but prejudice is part of the human condition.
Mm-hmm.
But whether it becomes something that's discrimination is not part of the human condition. Discrimination is an active action.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not about whether we make those judgments, because we make judgments as part of our survival as human beings, not necessarily judgments about people, but we make judgments all the time. Is it safe to cross the road? Should I go out? Should I step out now? Is it dark? Do I need a coat? All these are judgments we make. And when they become prejudice is when our judgment is without necessarily all the information. So just as you say, and it's based on what we call a kernel of truth. We may have heard something which applies to one or two people or a very few people, and then we take that and apply it to everybody with that characteristics. That's where it comes from. Mm-hmm. But the discrimination is the choice to act on that prejudice in a negative way. That's the simplest way I can describe it.
Yeah.
So yes, you might see the young Black man driving down the road in a car thinking, well, that's a very nice car for a Black man to have. That's the judgment. Yeah. That's why I'm going to stop you, because I think, Black men are more likely to steal cars. So therefore, Black man driving a nice car, let me just check he hasn't stolen it. Do you see that's where it comes, where nothing else has been done. So nothing else has been done. But, if it was a young white man driving, you think he's got a nice car.
End of. Yeah.
But I'm not stopping because of those things. And that's where those little things come into. The discrimination comes from where we act negatively on that point.
Yeah.
So, for example, in my experience, and you know, it's happened to me a few times, as you talk about the way I speak, if somebody listens to me on the phone, they don't often know that I'm black because of the way I speak. And if I've heard once, I've heard a million times, well, you don't sound black. Oh, I don't know. What does being black sound like? This is my voice. You know, this is, oh, right, okay. Well, I don't mean you because you don't sound black. Right, okay. What am I supposed to do with that information? And so, and then when I've come and met them in person, having spoken to them on the phone, they'll go, oh, and I can tell instantly in their face whether they expected me to look the way I do. And some people even say it. Oh, I didn't know you were black. Right. What am I supposed to do with that information?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I am. You know, now what? Now where do we go with this?
Yeah. And there's an important issue that I want to raise. I think a lot of people think that racism doesn't exist in the UK, and why should we care what is happening in America? How does it affect us? What would you say to that?
Well, I would refer them back to the example I gave you about my son driving in a car. Okay. Racism is about making those discriminatory judgments by choice based on a characteristic, based on a prejudiced idea about something, and then acting on it. And the systematic part of when people talk about structural or systematic racism, it's when the systems, the rules, the laws, the approaches, the strategies that are in place are actually based on those ideas as well. So the fact that you know, racism can be very subtle. You know, it often isn't as overt. It's not, you know, it's not as we see on the, you know, back in the 60s in the civil rights movement, people dragging in the streets. It's not as subtle as when my parents came to England in the 1960s, the very early 60s, where they were looking for houses to rent, and there were signs in the windows that said no dogs, no black, no Irish. It's not as overt as that. However, we would, you know, listen and talking to, you know, for example, to my children in the last few days and things that posted, you know, my daughter at the age of 7 or 8, you know, born, bred in the UK, very good friends, really good friends she's had from primary school. One of her friends at the age of 7 said to her, invited a little group of them round to tea and didn't invite my daughter, and said to her, I can't invite you because my dad doesn't like black people and I'm scared of what he might say to you. So it happens in the everyday. Just because we're not seeing, you know, people, you know, lines saying black, so you're white, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So, so they're the subtleties of it happening. And then there are the major things about it happening. So, for example, you know, the COVID-19 report that came out this year that shows the higher proportion of black and minority ethnic people dying from the disease. And a report comes out proving that to be the case in the UK, but with no recommendations of what we should do about it.
Is that because of... Because is it something to do with the DNA or the structure of a black person? I don't know the medical terms, but is that the way you're made up? Is the virus attacking black people because of, you know, a reason, or is it because of their living situations, or why is that?
Or it's probably a bit of all of the above. It's that part, going back to that intersectional bit. Intersection, you know, intersectional is the article that I wrote talked about a perfect storm, and a perfect storm is where lots of things come together and it just creates, you know, this destructive effect. So, you know, so for example, there is some research that suggests that very similar And remember, coronavirus is a new virus, so we've not had this virus before. That's why it's hitting us the way it is. So we haven't, as a human race, got a large amount of antibodies to fight this particular virus. Okay, so that's why when they talk about herd immunity, it's like when it's been around a bit, you develop some resistance to it. So like the flu, some people will get it and be really, really ill every year, and some people will get it and it'll be like a bit of a cold, and some people will die. And that happens every single year. This is not a new thing, but the scale of it is because we don't have herd immunity. Okay, so if we take that is the norm for everybody. So there is some research that shows that in previous viruses that are similar or have some similarity to coronavirus, like SARS, which we had a few years ago, that certain receptors in the body make you more, if you've got more of these receptors, it makes you more susceptible to having a really bad attack. And there is some research to show that those receptors are more prevalent in certain groups, particularly some Black communities. However, that's not enough to account for the disproportionate thing on its own.
Yeah.
And if it was simply something just about race, genetic, if it was simply only physical, then what we would see is that the rates would be highest in the countries where people are Black. Logically. Yeah. That's not the case. In fact, the rates are highest in America. but so that's not the case. So it can't only be that thing.
Yeah.
We've also found out that there are other things that make you more susceptible to having a poor outcome from coronavirus, and it might be poverty, it's exposure. So part of a virus is the risk. What's the chance? How often? The more chance that you're exposed to it, the higher chance that you're going to get it. So obviously you would expect that in healthcare workers who are working with people with coronavirus, they're exposed to it much more time. There's a higher risk. But if we look at who's delivering the care hands-on to people living with coronavirus or people who have coronavirus, and we've had higher proportions in care homes, for example. Many more of the Black minority healthcare workers are working on the front line in the areas where people have coronavirus, not just in intensive care, but in wide populations, because we all know intensive care has a few people in relative to the size of the patient population. But care homes, the hands-on, the frontline bit, they're more likely to be there. There's also reports which is around racism and structural racism and decision making about who gets the protection. So the PPE shortage we've talked about. So if you're more exposed, if you're more likely to be exposed, and you're more likely to be if you're from a racial or ethnic group which we know has a potentially more susceptible to the virus, and you're doing the hands-on job, and in distributing PPE, people are not, managers may be making decisions as who they give it to, then the perfect storm comes together.
Yeah. So
you're exposed to more.
Yeah. I know you haven't got all day to talk about this, but I want to cover what we've seen. Riots, we've seen marches. Marches are not a great idea at the minute, given that minorities are more susceptible, for one. What can people do to change what is going on? What is the best route? What can white people do? The allies? What can Black people do? Where do we go from here?
Can I just say, one of the things that have really struck me, and David Lammy talked about this when he was on the TV not long ago, is one of the things that's really struck me about this Black Lives Matter when I watched the protests, is that the protesters are not all Black. That the protesters are Black, they're white, they're young, they're old, they're gay, they're straight, they're disabled, they're without disability, there's a range. And that's one of the things that really has struck me about this, having said where it all started. Well, I read something yesterday that up to date, and as of yesterday, the Blackout Tuesday and the Black Lives Matters protests have happened in 50 states of the USA and across 18 countries. And as of yesterday, it stands as the biggest civil rights activist movement that's happened, which is wow. So the first thing is we talk about the protest, and it's not just Black people who've marching, and I think that's really important. And that brings me to my first thing is, I think it is important that people protest. I think they should socially distance and wear their masks and do all the safety things. You know, as a nurse, I have to say safety first. But I think people should protest. Many people have said to me about 2020, oh God, this is not the year that we expected. 2020 is the year of the nurse, in case you didn't know. So it's quite important that. But maybe 2020 is the restart button. Maybe 2020 is the year that we need. Maybe 2020 is the year that we say, actually, do you know what? This is not new, but enough is enough. So the first thing is and protesting might be taken to the streets, but protesting equally could be checking within your organisation whether your Black colleagues are okay. It could be about checking with your MP and making sure, you know, stating your disquiet or your in not agreement, your challenge to the racial profiling, the stop and search as a Black young man and not a white young man going about their own business. Educating ourselves, finding out what happens, learn something new. There are so many books, blogs. There's some great TEDx talks as well. So educate yourself and your friends and family around these things. And I think the third thing I would say absolutely is challenge. When you see somebody being discriminated against on the basis of their racial profile, challenge it in the same way that I would say challenge homophobia, you know, challenge disability rights, challenge transphobic actions, challenge race actions too. Don't wait for, it's not the job of your one Black friend or your one Black member of your family to be the person that speaks out, or the one person in the organization. As a white person, you have the right to be offended by racism in the same way and to speak up.
I've got to say, I've had personal experience of this. I worked for a company many years ago when I was younger, and I heard a lot of racial slurs, and I spoke up and nobody did anything about it. So I handed in my notice and I took my letter of resignation to the MD and laid it out in front of him, and he read it and he turned around to me and he said, "But you're not a P word." And he couldn't understand why that would offend me. And I ended up taking it to a tribunal. I won. I got a small payout, but I also had the whole company retrained on race equality. So as a white person, I stood up to something. Was it my job? No, but it was something that made me incredibly uncomfortable, and I stand. So people they don't have to take such a big stand. You don't have to put yourself in danger, but just saying that term offends me. I ran a bar and most of the people that came in were Asian and they use the P word all the time. I stopped them from using it because it offends me. And they thought I was crackers, but it causes me offense.
Yes, exactly. And that's the thing. And I think that's it. It's all our businesses. It's everybody's business. And it just allows us to show our humanity. We have to speak out. Then I'm less than this day for someone to say something actively racist to my face. I might experience the subtleties of it, but they're more likely to say it in your presence because they think they're on safe ground.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think that is the difference, because I am with somebody of colour as well. I don't hear as much racism probably as other people because people are aware of that. They're not going to say those kinds of things in front of me.
No. Exactly, and that's the difference. So I think it's as important for my white friends and colleagues and family members to be prepared as it is for me. So this is what I say, it's everybody's business to educate, to protest in a way that works for them, but ultimately to challenge. It's not enough to say I'm not racist. We have to be anti-racist in what we do.
Excellent. So a minute left. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
I think I would just like to say that, it's thank you for having me here to talk about this. And this is an opportunity for a conversation, because if we don't speak and remain silent, as you say, we allow these things to perpetuate. Our silence is our complicity with what goes on. We have to speak, and sometimes when we speak, it allows other people to be heard if they don't have a voice, or if they feel they cannot speak, or if they're just tired of saying the same thing over and over again.
Exactly that. Thank you ever so much, Laura. It's been ever so interesting, and I'm sure people have got lots of useful information from that. So the main message is ask questions, clarify what we call people, what the term is that the person you're interacting with is comfortable with. Ask what's right. So it's more about communication and understanding, really.
It is. It's about communication, understanding, and dialogue. And it's a good time to ask questions, because people appreciate that you're trying to understand in order to be better. As Mary Angelou said, when we know better, we do better.
Yes, exactly that. And I saw something interesting. Lots of people are speaking at the minute. I'll just finish with this about how people are rioting and it's wrong. And I think most of us would agree, rioting and damage to people, to anybody is wrong. However, when something happens to your own child, would you not go out and set the world on fire? Would you? I know I'm managed with my 3-year-old son to come in the middle of, I think it was the back in the day, it was the National Front and Anti-Nazi League, and seeing his legs buckle under him, almost dropping to the floor. And we were going into Woolworths, and I said, "What's wrong with you?" And he said, "Mummy, I'm scared." I got in the car shaking, and I wanted to drive my car into that group of people because they scared myself. They hadn't killed him or harmed him, but they'd scared him, and I wanted them to hurt. So you can understand people are feeling hurt.
Yes.
Is looting right? Do you think? I think that's where people are sort of starting to feel uncomfortable.
Yes, I think people will feel comfortable. I think people feel uncomfortable from overall. But remember what I said, this is not a new thing. Looting and rioting and those things, I'm not saying that they are right, and is that it's not a result of one action. It's a result of, like I say, the perfect storm of many things over many, many, many years. And I would ask this question, as people say, isn't it's terrible that, this young black man died, but I think the looting has to stop. Maybe we invert the question. It's terrible that looting's happening, but killing young black men needs to stop. Exactly
that. Yeah, people have been kneeling in silence, trying to show their support. And I think there's a saying, is it, those that do not hear must feel?
Yes. Oh yes. I was growing up with that phrase. If you can't hear, you must feel.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Excellent. Yeah. I'll leave it there then. Thank you ever so much, Laura. It's been very knowledgeable, and I shall be speaking to you later.
Yes, no doubt. Everybody just stay safe. That's what I would say.
Yes, thank you.